when he's passed away.
Circuit judge, because they tried it in state court.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, he was, so in the trial court and state court is circuit.
Oh, so the trials were in state court, not in federal court.
Robert, you might explain that to this group, what happened
Yeah.
there.
So FBI reopened the investigation in 97. We had a new agent in charge in Birmingham. He went around talking to people in the community. A lot of people in the community said, you need to reopen the filing of the church, which he did. So the FBI assigned an agent, and also Birmingham Police Department assigned a homicide detective to review all the files from the previous investigation. And so they did that from 97. After a couple of years, we started calling witnesses to the grand jury. So there had been in the old investigation names that were thought to be involved. Of course, in 1977, the Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley prosecuted one person, a guy named Robert Chambliss, for the murder of one of the children, Denise McNair, and got a conviction. Chambliss later died in prison. But there were some other names who had been mentioned in Chambliss, but a lot of witnesses had died. So we did a federal grand jury investigation because there was a federal statute that made it a crime to use explosives that had traveled in interstate commerce to damage a building or to hurt somebody. And since we didn't have any glad evidence of what type of explosive, we didn't know that, didn't know for sure that it was not made in Alabama, because dynamite was being manufactured in Alabama at the time. So even though it was, had we been able to come up with evidence that it had traveled interstate, we could have done it in federal court. But our assumption from the start was that it would wind up as a state court murder case. The death penalty statute that existed in '63 had been ruled unconstitutional, so we weren't going to be able to go for the death penalty. But we thought if we were able to put on a case good enough to get to the jury, we could at least make a state court murder case. And we finally charged two people in 2000. Bill Pryor was Attorney General of Alabama, and so our trial team was the U.S. Attorney, me, an assistant, and an assistant DA from Jefferson County. Prosecuted the first case. Me and Doug was in the former U.S. Attorney for the second trial in '02, but we, in both trials, operated under the authority of Bill Pryor. Of Bill Pryor, Attorney General.
I can't believe I'm blanking. I had a Cumberland School of Law, criminal law professor. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I think he was
Don Cochran.
Yes, Don Cochran.
So Don Cochran was an assistant U.S. attorney, and so he joined the team for the second trial.
Can I ask one final question?
He's now the U.S. attorney in Nashville.
How did what happened? Did you use the federal grand jury to gather evidence and transfer it to the state to indict in the state? You just presented that to the state grand jury?
We presented, we got a court order from federal district court to allow us to give the state the results of our federal grand jury information as permitted under Rule 6. And so then we presented a case for indictment to this Jefferson County grand jury.
How old were the defendants at
Hmm?
the time of the trial? How old were they?
Bobby Frank Cherry was in his 70s. Tommy Blanton, I think, was only in his late 60s when they were charged. You can see the foundation was blown out pretty low down. This was just a rubble stone foundation, but really sturdy and 30-something inches thick. So there was always urban legend out there that 12 sticks of dynamite, you know, some books were written that said 12 sticks of dynamite. We never had any evidence of 12 sticks of dynamite other than we knew back in the day some witnesses interviewed by the FBI had said that. But, no evidence that we had access to. This perspective of body size. This is from the interior, looking out. The firefighter there facing the camera had passed away. The gentleman standing in the opening there to the left was still around. He had been one of the ambulance operators, and he testified. The rear, this is the ladies' lounge. You can see that rear wall is a masonry wall. You can't see it that well in this picture, but there is a distinct pattern of damage to the wall of this straight line, and then you can't see, but it branches up like this and then down like this. You can see a little bit of that downward arc right there. And testimony from explosive experts was that that pattern of damage on masonry was characteristic of high explosive charge, so that was another evidence that it was a bomb. There's a sink back there that you can see up against the wall. That sink had been enclosed by a board wall, and Sarah Collins, who was Addie Mae's sister, was standing at that sink when the bomb went off, and she survived. So there were 5 girls in the lounge. One of them survived. That would be of that sink.
Did she survive without substantial injuries?
She lost an eye, and this is so the funeral home hearse served as an ambulance for African Americans because hospitals wouldn't use ambulances. This is Sarah. She spent about 6 months in the hospital. Lots of injuries, including injuries to both eyes. She lost one eye. Back in 1963, they did not have trauma counselors or any of the psychological, medical treatments that we might have today. So as soon as she was released from the hospital, she was sent back to school. No counseling, no nothing. So she continued to have rather severe psychological effects from this. But she's still around and functioning pretty well, but she never quite got over Chambliss was known as Dynamite Bob around Birmingham, widely reputed to have been responsible for several bombings. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan Eastview Clavern 13. So they had chapters of the Klan that were organized into what they called Claverns with a K. And so he was a member of Clavern 13, which met in what is now the Crestwood area. He was, as I said, prosecuted in '77 by Bill Baxley and two of Baxley's assistants, and was convicted. One person who testified against him was his wife's niece named Elizabeth Cobb. Elizabeth Cobb was, at the time of the '77 trial, a minister in the United Methodist Church. I think one of the first United Methodist woman ordained preachers in Alabama. And she testified to having overheard Chambliss and others talking about the bombing. Chambliss died in prison in 1985, never admitted his role in the bombing, and a cellmate of his told us that every night before he went to bed, he prayed to God to curse Bill Baxley. So actually that made an impact on somebody. Tommy Blanton, this is what he looked like in '63. He was in his 20s back then. After the bombing, of course, the FBI, Blanton and Chambliss both were, knew the FBI considered them suspects back in time. The FBI gets a lot of flack for not bringing a charge. They were there the day it happened in 1963, and they investigated it until 1968, when J. Edgar Hoover closed the file based on his conclusion that there was not sufficient evidence to win a conviction. But the agents that worked on the case were extremely dedicated, did a lot of work on the case. It was just an enormous amount of information, most of which was useless to us because somebody died, but they did hundreds and hundreds of interviews. It did, and used some other unique techniques that we'll talk about. But after the bombing, Blanton just lived like a hermit, and by the time we came along in the late '90s and started looking into it again, he was living in a trailer behind the house of a friend of his over by the old Birmingham Fairgrounds, I guess what's now the Aquatic Center. But and his trailer didn't have any electricity, didn't have any water, and he had gone to night law school since the bombing, never passed the bar. But and he spent his time filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to find out what the FBI knew about the bombing. And there really was very little new evidence Bobby Frank Cherry. This is the way he looked in '63. He moved to Texas shortly after the bombing. He had been married. His first wife died. They had 5 children. He married his first wife's sister. That didn't last very long. He wound up getting married a total of 5 times, but his third wife, who he hooked up with before leaving Birmingham, was a truck driver, lady truck driver named Willadine. And so Willadine had 3 children, and when Frank and Willadine decided they were going to run off together, Frank took his 5 children and put them in an orphanage and left. And went to Texas with Willadine. So that's kind of that Frank was. There were also horror stories from the children. One of the oldest son, who was, this guy went by Bobby Frank Cherry. His son, first son went by Frank, and when we were doing all this, Texas Monthly came out with an investigative reporting piece featuring the son, Frank, called Sins of the Father, which was made into a made-for-TV movie on the FX channel. So, but one thing that once we started doing a grand jury investigation, we called a bunch of Cherry's family members to the grand jury. And so it was, I mean, there were a lot of them we called, because he was a prime suspect. And of course he's out in Texas. But some of them would come out, and after their grand jury testimony would hold a press conference on the front steps of the Eagle courthouse and rail against the government. And so finally, after a few months, Frank out in Texas hired a lawyer, and he and his lawyer had a press conference covered by national TV, where Frank rails against the government. And but his press conference got the phone to ringing. So a lot of people across the country saw Frank Cherry give a press conference saying he didn't do this bombing. The government was just harassing him. So one person that called was Willadine, who he had run off with. And so she was living in Washington State, in Bremerton, Washington, on the coast of Washington. And so she calls her local FBI office, which was 250 miles away from Bremerton, but tells them she used to be married. She saw this guy on TV, she used to be married to him, she thought he was dead, but she knew he did it and wanted to tell the FBI about it. So our case agents flew into Washington and interviewed Willadine. She turned out to be a fabulous source of information. Frank had told her that he did it and a bunch of other things. We also got a call from Cherry's granddaughter, who was the daughter of his son, Frank, and she saw the press conference. She said that her grandfather had sexually abused her when she was a child, but but she had heard him admit that he had done it. There was also another witness who had worked laying carpet with Jerry, who called and said that Jerry had told him he had done it. There was also Willadine's brother, said the same thing. He heard Jerry say he'd done it. And there was a guy named Bobby Birdwell who was living in Birmingham, who was the same age as one of Jerry's children growing up. And he called and said that he remembered being in Jerry's house and seeing a Klan robe laid out on the bed, and overheard some significant conversation at the dinner table. So he testified against Jerry. I don't think we have a photograph of it on here. Also, there was a newspaper reporter in Mississippi named Jerry Mitchell, who covered a lot of the old civil rights cold cases. So we got a call from him one day, and by this time Spike Lee had done a documentary, Poor Little Girls. So we got a call from Jerry Mitchell saying, "If y'all really look closely at Spike Lee's movie, I think he's got a frame that's got Jerry in it." So we pulled out the movie, looked at it again, and sure enough, there's a scene in Spike Lee's movie where Reverend Shuttlesworth is outside of Phillips High School trying to register his children, and he gets attacked by this mob of white men. And when you really slow it down and look at it frame by frame, Jerry is very recognizable in that film clip. And you can see Jerry appears to go into his pocket with one hand and then, makes a motion toward Shuttlesworth as though he's hitting him with something. And when Jerry was interviewed by the FBI, he told the FBI that he had hit Shuttlesworth with a pair of brass knuckles when Shuttlesworth was trying to integrate us in school. So we had pretty good evidence that the court was put on about motive there. And plus we got to talk to Spike Lee, which is good.
When did he come out?
In Montgomery today, part of downtown was closed off because Spike Lee was making a movie today.
So, but he was funny. One time I was going to Doug's office, and Doug said, "Come here, I want to play you a voicemail." And so it says, "Doug, Spike, call." And Spike Lee had interviewed a lot of, he said he had, on the documentary, it has interviews of parents of the children that were killed. And so that was all. But Cherry and some others of Eastview Clavern 13 disagreed with the local Klan leadership about the way to approach segregation and other issues they had. And so they formed a splinter group that met under a bridge on Highway 280 crossing the Cahaba River. So this is 280 bridge over the Cahaba River, the modern portion on the upper left, and the old portion is still, I think it's still there. And they met under that bridge. They call themselves the Cahaba River Group. And they thought the Klan should be more violent. So they plotted to try to move the Klan in a more violent direction. The then imperial wizard of the Klan was a guy named Robert Shelton, Bobby Shelton, and the local Klan leader was a guy named Robert Sidney Thomas. They were both still alive. I put Bobby Shelton on the grand jury. You know, like I say, we put every Klan member of this group that was still alive. Put J.B. Stoner on the grand jury, if y'all remember that name. J.B. Stoner was a Georgia, came pretty darn close to getting elected governor of Georgia back in the 60s, or late 50s.
It wasn't close, but I think he got like 20,000 votes, which is pretty scary.
Well, he said he got close. But and these guys were all like in their late 70s, maybe early 80s. And Shelton came across as pretty subdued, but J.D. Stoner showed up for grand jury in seersucker suit with a pearl-handled cane and a straw boater, and he looked like the sweetest little grandpa you ever saw until he opens his mouth and it's just villain. You know, he did not change a bit. But this is where we had some testimony from some Klan folks that the bombing of the church was discussed. So this is back to the day of the bombing, and the local neighborhood, because Birmingham police did not really do what could have been done to protect African American residences and businesses. The local folks formed their own civil defense group that did their own patrolling. And so if you see the man with the hard hat on in the bottom left part of this frame, his name is James Lay, and he was a member of the local civil defense force. And he told the FBI in '63 that 2 weeks before the bombing, he had been patrolling and was passing the church in the wee hours of the morning and observed a vehicle about where that white car is in the right lower part of the screen. And so he shined his flashlight on it, and he recognized Robert Chambliss sitting in the passenger seat, and he saw a man at those concrete steps that had been there with a satchel in his hand, and he identified that person as Tommy Blanton. So that was in 1963. For some reason, Bill Baxley never got that report, although he knew James Lay's name, but he was under the impression that James Lay had said this happened the night of the bombing. So he wanted Mr. Lay to testify at the Chambliss trial that he had seen Chambliss and Blanton the night before. Mr. Lay kept saying, no, it was 2 weeks before. Baxley just got mad at him and never called him. But, and Mr. Lay had developed a difficult attitude toward law enforcement people trying to investigate this bombing. So he would not tell us anything, but we felt like he wanted to tell his story. He just didn't want to tell us. So we just put him on the state grand jury cold. Said, you know anything about this? And he told this fantastic story. He had this deep voice. He just came across as super credible. He was going to be our star witness. At the Blanton trial, we tried Blanton first. 2 weeks before trial, he has a stroke, can't speak. So, a lot of these, this was literally the last, we tried these cases at the last moment they could have been tried. That's a lot of the key witnesses were dead within a year. And unfortunately, Mr. Lay.